September 1940. Dawn crawled over the flat fields of East Anglia with a pale, smoky light, revealing the wreckage of yet another bomber that had barely survived the previous day's raid. The Wellington lay crooked on the runway, its left engine burned to a scorched husk, its fuselage torn open as if ripped by claws. Ground crews moved through the drifting mist in silence, pulling out bodies stiffened by cold and smoke. The smell of burned oil, cordite, and wet earth settled over the airfield like a shroud. This scene, once unthinkable, had become routine. Britain's daylight raids over Germany were collapsing under the weight of hard reality. The first year of the war had exposed every flaw in the pre-war theories that promised bombers would always get through. Instead of striking their targets in clean daylight lines, British aircraft were intercepted in minutes by radar-guided fighters. Messerschmitts dropped from the sun with surgical precision, scattering formations that were supposed to rely on mutual protection. Gunners found themselves shooting at shadows, overwhelmed by speed and angles they had never trained to counter. Flak batteries lashed the sky with black bursts that tossed aircraft like toys. Crews returned, if they returned, with shredded wings, failing hydraulics, and stories of cockpits turned into furnaces by cannon fire. Losses mounted not by dozens, but by percentages. The air staff watched the statistics with tightening jaws. Daylight flying over the Reich had become a death sentence. The German air defense network was too strong, too coordinated, too unforgiving. Industrial targets lay deep inside this web, reachable only by aircraft that could no longer survive the journey. The British bomber force, fragile and still growing, could not be spent at this rate. Hard decisions were made in reinforced rooms lit by dim bulbs. The daylight campaign would end. The shift began with dimmed hangars and new schedules pinned to briefing room walls. Crews accustomed to charting routes through the morning sky now studied maps inked with lunar cycles, blackout zones, and radar avoidance paths. Engines warmed not at dawn, but near midnight, their thunder muffled by fog and cloud cover. The darkness swallowed every aircraft as it lifted, replacing precision with anonymity. Through moving sheets of cloud, no factory chimneys or rail yards could be seen, only the faint glow of cities braced under blackout curtains. Thus emerged a new doctrine, shaped less by choice than by survival. Targets would no longer be the intricate machinery of the German war economy, but the vast urban zones that fed it. Workers' homes, administrative centers, industrial districts carpeted together in sprawling blocks. Area bombing became the strategic answer to the impossibility of daytime accuracy. If specific targets could not be struck, then all targets within a city would become the objective. Fire, not precision, would carry the war forward. While Britain faded into the nighttime sky, across the ocean an opposite vision solidified. American air theorists sketched sunlight-bright diagrams, tracing the paths of tight bomber formations that relied on firepower and discipline rather than darkness. Their faith lay in technology, the Norden sight, the heavy bomber, the belief that accuracy was not a dream, but a scientific certainty. To them, daylight was not a coffin, but a proving ground. Two doctrines, born from the same war, yet shaped by different scars, now stood on opposing trajectories. Both would soon converge over the heart of Europe, where only one sky, day or night, would decide the future of strategic bombing.
In the years before the United States entered the war, when Europe was already burning, a completely different vision of air warfare was taking shape far from the front lines. Under the clear skies of Alabama and Texas, where heat shimmered above concrete runways and the scent of engine oil mixed with dust, American air officers built a doctrine that worshipped daylight as if it were a strategic weapon of its own. From the polished floors of training hangars to the echoing classrooms of the Air Corps Tactical School, the same conviction was repeated like scripture. Daylight brought clarity, and clarity brought precision. In this world of charts, diagrams, and rehearsed formations, sunlight was not a danger but a promise. The man who observed these developments from the side saw how the curriculum shaped a generation of officers. They studied the Norden bomb sight as if it were a sacred instrument, a device that could, under perfect conditions, drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. They watched instructors demonstrate the mathematics of wind drift and impact angles with the confidence of men who believed that technology could discipline chaos. Here, in this controlled environment, the chaos of Britain's experience seemed distant, almost irrelevant. American planners believed that the key to victory was not in the cloak of night, but in the unwavering logic of daylight. From these teachings emerged the heavy bomber doctrine. Aircraft like the B-17 and B-24 were designed not merely as machines of destruction, but as flying fortresses, bristling with machine guns, armored with self-confidence, and structured to operate in tight combat boxes that overlapped fields of fire into a supposedly impenetrable shield. Officers walked between parked bombers with a sense of controlled pride, their boots echoing off aluminum skins as ground crews loaded belts of .50 caliber rounds into gun turrets. Everything about these machines radiated the belief that discipline could defeat any threat. American airmen trained for missions they imagined would unfold like textbook diagrams. Aircraft climbing in staggered waves, locking into geometric formations, threading through German airspace with mathematical precision. In these scenarios, the enemy's response appeared orderly and predictable. Fighter attacks were met with synchronized bursts from turrets positioned across every axis. German interceptors would be shredded before they could exploit any weakness. Losses, according to theory, would be minimal. Victory would be statistical. Yet, even before the first American raids over Europe began, cracks formed between the Allied partners. British officers, hardened by years of failure under the sunlight, warned that no amount of guns or discipline could overcome the brutality of German defenses. They had watched their own doctrine collapse, watched entire squadrons disappear under coordinated strikes of Messerschmitts and flak batteries. When they spoke to their American counterparts, they did so with the weight of experience, urging caution, urging adaptation. But the Americans saw caution as defeatism, an unnecessary shadow cast over a doctrine that was still pristine. Disagreements sharpened in smoke-filled briefing rooms and conference halls where maps of Europe stretched across entire walls. British commanders insisted that the Reich's airspace was a killing ground in daylight, that no formation, no matter how tight or heavily armed, could endure the ferocity of coordinated fighter attacks. American officers countered with numbers, projections, and unwavering conviction in the Norden sight. The tension between the two sides grew, shaping conversations long before the bombers themselves crossed the English Channel. When the first American units finally arrived in Britain, the cultural and strategic contrast became unmistakable. British ground crews watched American bomb groups assemble in the morning light, with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. The engines of dozens of B-17s roared in unison, sending vibrations through the earth as they prepared to climb into skies the British no longer dared enter. The Americans carried themselves with the confidence of men who believed the future belonged to them. Their machines gleamed in the pale English sun, their formations rising with perfect symmetry, as if war itself would respect the beauty of their design. But even as the bombers lifted, the man observing these developments from the side understood that doctrine, no matter how polished, would soon face the truth that Britain had learned through fire. The skies over Europe did not bend for theories or training manuals. They demanded proof written in metal, fuel, and blood. And that proof, whether glorious or catastrophic, was approaching rapidly, carried northward by every bomber that vanished beyond the horizon.
January 1943. The wind coming from the Atlantic carried the smell of wet stone and dust into the whitewashed villa where the Allies gathered for the Casablanca Conference. Behind its shuttered windows, far from the front lines, maps unfurled across polished tables as British and American commanders leaned over them with the weight of divergent philosophies on their shoulders. The man who watched from the edge of these rooms saw how every discussion, every gesture, every glance revealed an invisible fracture running through the alliance, a fracture born from the skies over Europe. Winston Churchill arrived with the scars of Britain's early failures etched into his voice. His commanders spoke in the cold, restrained tones of men who had sent too many crews into daylight and seen too few return. They brought charts of losses so steep that the numbers seemed to drain the color from the walls. Squadrons shredded by Messerschmitts, entire formations falling apart under flak. Bombers found days later in fields or rivers, or not found at all. The British argument was grim and unadorned. Daylight raids over Germany could not be sustained. Not by them, not by anyone. Across the same table, the American delegation carried an opposite conviction. Their uniforms were crisp, their doctrines still unbloodied, their confidence unshaken by catastrophe. They entered the conference rooms with the belief that daylight precision was not merely a tactic, but a strategic necessity, an idea worth defending even against their closest ally. They spoke of the Norden site as if it were alchemy, of combat boxes as if geometry itself offered protection. Their generals straightened maps, traced flight paths with immaculate fingers, and argued that Germany's industrial heart could only be destroyed by accurate daytime attacks. The two sides met not with explosions or gunfire, but with the cold clash of incompatible realities. British officers warned that American bombers would meet the same fate as theirs had, picked apart in the open sky long before reaching the target. They emphasized that Britain's shift to night was not a matter of preference, but survival. Their words carried the weight of knowledge earned from the wreckage of 1939 and 1940. But the Americans countered with a political truth they did not voice aloud. Abandoning daylight warfare now would be seen as retreat, a concession before the first major raids had even begun. In Washington, daylight accuracy had become more than doctrine, it had become identity. Losing it would mean losing face, and no general in the room was prepared to let that happen. As debates stretched into the night, the man standing at the periphery felt the room tighten with a sense of historical inevitability. Ashtrays overflowed as staff officers whispered over notes, while outside the villa, jeeps rumbled along the dirt roads carrying couriers and intelligence updates. The world waited for this conference to define the next phase of the war. Then came the breaking point. On a night lit dimly by hurricane lamps, the American General Staff gathered in a side room to draft a memorandum that would shape the future of strategic bombing. The atmosphere was thick with exhaustion and determination. Some officers paced, others hunched over typewriters, their fingers hammering out arguments in clipped sentences. They wrote of moral obligations, industrial targets, the synergy of air and ground campaigns. They described daylight precision not as a theory, but as a cornerstone of victory. Every paragraph was a plea wrapped in certainty. By dawn, the document lay finished, cold, forceful, and unyielding. It reached Churchill's advisers by mid-morning. It did not change their minds, but it clarified one truth. America would not abandon daylight. Not now, not ever. Hours later, the agreement took shape, not through triumph, but through compromise etched in fatigue. Britain would continue its night offensive, harnessing the shadows to burn German cities.
America would strike by day, committed to precision, even if the price was yet unknown. The phrase around-the-clock bombing entered the war lexicon that afternoon, spoken with the gravity of a pact sealed by necessity. As the delegates dispersed, the man watching understood that this was more than a diplomatic settlement. It was the moment two divergent doctrines were locked into a single strategy. Two paths converging toward a battlefield neither side fully understood. Outside, the North African sun blazed overhead, bright and merciless. Soon that same brightness would test the American faith in daylight, and the sky over Europe would reveal whether the decision made in Casablanca was brilliance or madness.
By the summer of 1943, the decision made in Casablanca had left the Allies with no path of retreat. American bombers would fly by day, no matter the cost, and now the cost began to reveal itself with brutal clarity. Each morning, over the English countryside, runways shook beneath the engines of B-17s and B-24s warming in the pale light. The man watching from the control tower saw the same ritual repeated with grim precision. Crews climbing aboard, with cigarettes still burning between their fingers, ground crews stepping back from engines that belched black smoke, and formations rising into a sky that looked calm from the ground but held death waiting in its upper layers. The German response came quickly and without mercy. Radar stations in occupied Europe tracked the American formations the moment they crossed the channel, and fighter controllers brought squadrons of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs into precise intercept positions. Their attacks were nothing like the diagrams American instructors had drawn in training fields thousands of miles away. The German fighters did not circle or probe. They dove straight through the bomber boxes, firing 20mm cannon shells that tore through aluminum as if it were paper. Entire nose sections vanished in flashes of fire. Engines burst apart, bomb bays filled with smoke. Crews fought flames with blankets and extinguishers, coughing through oxygen masks as temperatures climbed. On some missions, the first bomber fell before the formations reached the Dutch coast. Then came the missions that would mark the turning point in blood. Regensburg. Schweinfurt. In August and October 1943, the American bomber force attempted to strike deep into the Reich. Ball-bearing factories, aircraft plants, targets so vital that planners believed destroying them might cripple the German war effort. The man on the ground saw how these operations were launched with the seriousness of a final exam. Briefings delivered with hollow voices, crews given last-minute updates about weather, flat concentrations, and expected fighter resistance. Yet nothing could fully prepare them for what waited over the heart of Germany. The Regensburg raid began with early morning sunlight glinting off the bomber wings as the first formation headed southeast. There was no escort beyond a certain point. American fighters simply lacked the range, and the German interceptors struck with a fury sharpened by months of experience fighting the RAF at night and the U.S. Air Forces by day. Bomber after bomber fell away from the formation, trailing smoke, spiraling toward the ground in long, terrible arcs. Crews bailed out into a sky filled with burning debris. Others remained trapped in aircraft that held together longer than anyone believed possible, limping toward Switzerland or crashing in fields they never saw. Schweinfurt was worse. The ball-bearing factories were hit. The mission succeeded tactically, but the price was catastrophic. 33 bombers lost on the first raid, 60 more on the second. Hundreds of men killed, captured, or missing. Mechanics stood on English runways counting the returning aircraft in disbelief as gaps appeared in the formations, gaps that widened into entire missing squadrons. The man who watched these returns understood that the reality of daylight bombing was no longer theoretical. The doctrine was surviving, but at a rate measured in human lives. Every mission produced more evidence of both its potential and its brutality. Bombs did strike factories with accuracy impossible at night. Industrial output wavered under the pressure.
but the crews paid with flesh and bone for every precision impact recorded on commanders' maps. On the ground, rumors spread through the barracks, whispers about missions with survival odds no better than those of infantry in the worst trench assaults of the First World War. Some crews folded letters into their pockets before takeoff, messages meant to be found among wreckage. Others boarded their bombers with expressions carved into stone, knowing the mathematics of attrition were closing in. Yet, even as the losses rose, the campaign did not stop, could not stop. The American command insisted that daylight precision remained the only path to crippling Germany's war-making core. The British, watching from their night-focused command centers, said little. They had already learned what sunlight demanded. Now the Americans were learning the same lesson, but in their own way. As autumn settled over Europe, the skies filled with a colder, harsher light, and beneath that light, the man observed an undeniable truth taking shape. Daylight bombing had not failed, but neither had it proved its worth. The doctrine endured, but the bomber crews who carried it forward were being consumed by the very philosophy meant to guarantee victory. What the Allies needed now was not courage, nor discipline, nor theory. They needed something that could change the sky itself, and that change was already on its way.
By early 1944, a new shape began to appear above the airfields of southern England, sleek, long-legged, and carrying a predatory confidence that had been missing from the skies for far too long. The P-51 Mustang, its nose painted in the bright colors of American fighter groups, idled at dispersal pads, while its pilots strapped in with a calmness born not from arrogance, but from the knowledge that the air war over Europe was about to change forever. The man who watched these departures each morning saw the difference instantly. The fighters no longer launched merely to cover the bomb group on departure and return. Now they lifted into the sky with a new freedom, one that would rewrite the doctrine forged in Casablanca. At high altitude, German controllers continued to vector their fighters toward incoming American formations, expecting the same battered escortless bombers they had shattered in 1943. But now, long before the German interceptors could dive into the bomber stream, Mustangs slipped into their path like steel shadows. Unlike earlier escorts, the P-51s did not cling to the bombers. They did not circle defensively. They ranged outward, hunting for the Luftwaffe itself. The first encounters were brutal in their efficiency. Messerschmitts dove in expecting to see the unprotected arcs of bomber wings, only to find American fighters rising to meet them, engines screaming as they climbed into attack. Dogfights erupted in the cold air, far from the bomber formations, and for the first time since the war began, the Germans found themselves on the defensive at the very moment they tried to strike. The man observing the report saw a pattern forming. Engagements were happening farther from the bomber stream, German squadrons were breaking apart faster, and pilots long considered untouchable were failing to return. The Luftwaffe's backbone, its veteran corps, began to fracture. These were men who had flown through Poland, France, and the Battle of Britain, men whose experience made them lethal opponents. But 1944 demanded more than experience. It demanded stamina, fuel, and numbers. Germany had none to give. Every skilled pilot lost now represented a wound that could not heal, because the replacements arriving from training schools were scarcely more than boys. They came forward with a handful of flight hours, hesitant in combat, and terrified of the sky they had been taught to dominate. The P-51 pilots saw the difference immediately. They described German formations that looked disorganized, climbing too steeply, turning too slowly, reacting too late. Many of the new German pilots never saw the fighters lining up behind them until the tracers passed their canopy. Others panicked, pulling into climbs that stalled their aircraft and left them helpless. The men analyzing combat reports understood that this was not mere misfortune, it was systemic collapse. Even the famed Gruppen of Germany's fighter elite could not escape the downward spiral. Fuel shortages crippled training. Engine parts were scarce. Airfields were bombed repeatedly. Squadrons that once boasted experienced leaders now depended on young officers barely old enough to vote. And above them, the Americans flew missions that stretched across the continent, protected by the one aircraft designed for exactly this purpose. A fighter that could climb with a Messerschmitt, turn with a Focke-Wulf, and fly deep into Germany without fear of running out of fuel. By spring, the change was unmistakable. Luftwaffe intercepts no longer resembled coordinated waves, but scattered attempts by fragmented squadrons. When the bombers crossed into the Reich, the airspace that once flashed with the deadly choreography of German interceptors now felt thinner, weaker. The man who watched the bomb groups return at dusk saw fewer gaps in their formations. The crippling losses of Schweinfurt and Regensburg were fading into memory, not because the dangers had disappeared, but because the skies were being reshaped by a force the Luftwaffe could no longer match. The collapse accelerated with each passing month. German commanders pleaded for more fuel, more trained pilots, more time. But time was the one resource the Allies controlled completely. Every raid burned another layer of Germany's industrial capability. Every escort mission bled another handful of irreplaceable aces from the Luftwaffe's roster. Reports showed squadrons flying with men who had never seen combat, facing opponents who had flown dozens of sorties. The imbalance was catastrophic. By mid-1944, the man watching the war unfold understood that the turning point had arrived not through a single battle, but through the slow, relentless erosion of a system stretched beyond endurance. The Luftwaffe was breaking, not because its aircraft were inferior, nor because its pilots lacked courage, but because its foundation had been drained by years of attrition, shortages, and impossibly shifting priorities. The P-51 Mustang did not simply protect bombers, it broke the very structure of German air defense. As summer deepened and new Allied invasions began on the European mainland, the sky over the Reich no longer belonged to the hunters who had ruled it in 1940. Now it belonged to the machines and men who carried the doctrine of daylight forward, reshaping the war far above the ground where armies marched. And yet, even with the Luftwaffe collapsing, the question remained unanswered. What had this long struggle between two doctrines truly achieved? The answer would emerge only when the war itself began to fade, leaving the sky quiet at last.
By the spring of 1945, when Allied armies were closing in on the collapsing Reich from every direction, the sky over Europe had become almost unrecognizable compared to the one that had existed in 1940. The man who studied the final operational maps saw a pattern that told a story far greater than the sum of any single battle. Britain's night raids and America's daylight operations, once competing visions shaped by necessity and conviction, had fused into a relentless rhythm that no air defense system on Earth could withstand. The war of doctrines had reached its end, not in a single moment of triumph, but through the steady, coordinated destruction of everything the German war machine depended on. In those final months, the night sky glowed red over German cities as RAF Lancasters spread incendiaries across residential districts, industrial zones, and administrative centers. Entire regions burned in waves that lasted until dawn. Hours later, when smoke still curled into the air and streets lay twisted beneath rubble, the American bombers came. Their silhouettes appeared through haze and cloud, engines drumming with mechanical certainty as they descended towards specific targets: rail hubs, oil refineries, factories whose chimneys no longer belched smoke because their workforce and power lines were already shattered by the night's assault. Day overlaid night, night prepared day. Each campaign amplified the other. What Germany faced was not a choice between darkness and light, but a continuous storm that erased the line between them. The man observed how the combined effect achieved what neither doctrine could accomplish alone. Night raids weakened entire cities, breaking the infrastructure required for recovery. Storage depots, power networks, and housing districts were crushed under firestorms. Daylight precision then targeted the surviving industrial arteries with devastating accuracy, making repairs impossible. When the RAF cracked the shell, the USAAF shattered the core. By early 1945, German production maps showed factories operating at fractions of their capacity. Synthetic fuel plants, once the pride of German engineering, lay silent. Aircraft units were grounded not because of enemy fighters, but because no fuel remained to fly. For the Luftwaffe, already crippled by losses to American escorts, the continuous bombing tore away their last reserves. Airfields were cratered, maintenance hangars collapsed, flight schools scattered. Even the most experienced pilots could no longer take to the skies. The man saw the shift in combat reports.
Sorties dwindled from dozens to scattered, desperate attempts by lone fighters climbing into overwhelming odds. The end of the doctrinal conflict arrived quietly, almost invisibly, overshadowed by the collapse of the Reich itself. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, planners in both London and Washington looked back at the long arc of the air war. What they saw was not victory for a single approach, but the emergence of something entirely new, a combined, interdependent system of strategic bombing that fused British endurance with American precision. This synthesis became the blueprint for the post-war world. In the United States, the lessons hardened into doctrine. Strategic Air Command was formed with long-range bombers at its heart, designed not for mere support of ground operations, but to shape geopolitics through the threat of global reach. The legacy of daylight precision evolved into an ideology of deterrence, bombers as instruments of policy, not just weapons of war. In Britain, the night bombing tradition survived as institutional memory, influencing Cold War planning and the development of nuclear delivery strategies. But amidst the strategic triumph, another reality remained, etched in war diaries, mission logs, and the grief of families waiting at airfields that never saw their loved ones return. The man reviewing the final casualty lists understood the cost with chilling clarity. Thousands of airmen died carrying forward both doctrines. They flew through burning flat corridors, through fighter attacks that tore entire crews apart, through winter storms that swallowed formations whole. They lived in cold, pressurized cabins that sometimes ruptured without warning, and they died in machines that fell silently through cloud layers dense with smoke. No victory, no synthesis of ideas could erase their absence. When the last missions were flown and the engines cooled for the final time, silence settled over the airfields that had once roared with departures. In that silence lay the true conclusion of the War of Doctrines, a recognition that strategic philosophy, no matter how brilliant or flawed, demanded payment in human lives. The skies over Europe had been a proving ground, but the proof was written in blood, British and American alike. And so, as the man closed the final chapter of his wartime records, he understood what history would remember. Not merely the doctrines, not the debates in Casablanca, not the aircraft that carried the campaigns forward, but the simple truth that victory in the air had come from a fusion of darkness and daylight, from two nations whose differences had forged a single unstoppable force. The storm had passed. The sky was quiet again. But beneath that calm lay the memory of those who never returned. A silent reminder that every doctrine, no matter how successful, carries a human cost that outlives the war itself.